Welcome to Story Hour, a virtual meetup hosted by Wolf and Heron.
My maternal great-grandmother, we call Nona, got married at 19 years old. Her husband was friends with the family in Italy and saw her in the garden and thought she was beautiful and wanted to marry her. And they came to America after that. So here is a 19-year-old newly married to someone she barely knows, traveling on a huge boat to a country she does not know with a language she does not know. But she did it very courageously, and also her mother told her she thought it was a good idea, and she thought she'd have a better life here. So my Nonna Luisa came over from Italy. She lived in the Glens Falls area until her husband passed away, and then she moved in with my grandmother and grandfather in Del Mar and lived upstairs in the attic in their house. She lived to be 94, so I got to know her for much of my life, and she was very warm and kind and funny, very spunky. My mom's aunt, let me back up. My great-grandmother wanted to give my mother some money for me and my sister. And my great aunt kind of scolded my mom for taking it. And my great-grandmother, as my mom was leaving, just snuck it into her pocket and said, shh. So that sort of like, I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care what anyone tells me, was something about her. But she was so warm and loving and just a constant for, till I was about 21 when she passed away. My paternal grandmother grew up in a mining town in Pennsylvania, and she also was married early. She got married at 20. She came from her father died in the mines when she was 2. Her stepfather was very abusive towards her. But again, my grandmother had some spunk and probably didn't take to being disciplined too well. But she got out of the house as soon as she could, ended up getting married to my grandfather, lived in Crescent, Pennsylvania and Buffalo, New York, and then eventually settled in Troy. What's interesting about both these women, is they both lost children. My paternal grandmother lost a baby at 6 months old. My great-grandmother lost her son when he was 19. They both lost husbands. My great-grandmother lost her husband in the 50s. My grandfather died 4 months after I was born, and her second husband died probably about 7 years after they were married. So they both lived out their golden years being very strong single women. Both had some spunk. Both came from very different lives and definitely different growing up and background, but they had some things in common. I feel like they were both had some courage and took chances and looked at life with an optimism. And I tell this story during this story of me, like this topic of the story of you, because I feel like their lives interwove to help create my identity. Especially the older I get, I see more of them in me. I definitely have the spunk. I definitely think I do what I want sometimes, even if someone says don't do that. And so I just, when this topic came up, like I said before, it felt boring to talk about me and where I went to school and what I graduated with and what I'm doing now. It felt way more interesting to talk about those who came before me and how they impacted who I am. And both of these women, my great-grandmother lived to be 94. My grandmother passed away last year at 99. So they were around for a very long time, lived through various parts of what's going on in the country, depression, wars, and all that. And just both made very much a great impact on me and who I am. And that's part of the story of me, I guess.
Yeah!
I don't know.
Thank you, Lynne.
I don't know.
You have very inspiring women in your life.
I know.
Oh, Okay, so what should Lynne
Very
hold on
feisty.
to? What was compelling? What worked?
I think it was, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Armand.
I think it was a pretty interesting story. You know, there were times that I was trying to connect the dots and see the big picture story. But I think by the end, I was very curious and I could tell the story that, oh, that's how all of these pieces are connecting together. So I think it's a pretty well-established story, and it definitely made me curious to know more about your ancestry, history, and how it impacted you.
Sonia.
I just could, I don't know, if heard stories of Lynne, I think 3 times or so now. And I think what you do so well is like this personal, very casual, unpracticed, and so authentic connection to yourself in the story. It's like present everywhere. And I could just listen forever into all these stories because they are so much, you know, they are like a pattern, like this pattern of you evolves through these stories, and it's like puzzle pieces, and they all are so natural and fit in so well. And I think it's really, especially how personal you make it with the details, and it somehow makes total sense to me who you are. It's like this becoming thing. It's really pretty.
Thank you so much.
Else. Go ahead, Kara. Oh, John, go ahead.
I think telling your story from the angle or through the lens of the stories of people that you've been close to is a wonderful way to tell your story. And, you know, I just love the characters of your great grandmothers and how, like, they had it hard, you know, they went through some really hard stuff. It would be unusual in this day in America to encounter, like, I learned a second language because I wanted to learn a second language, not because I needed to. Like, I've never had to, adjust and assimilate to a new culture and a new setting. I've never lost somebody that I love except for my grandparents, which is just part of life. I've certainly never buried one of my children. And yet you describe these women as having a lot of spunk and optimism. So I thought that was wonderful. And people, especially now, because like everybody's always pissed off. Like if you look at where we are now in the grand scheme of history, if you look at us compared to people in, you know, any previous century, we've pretty much figured out like 99% of our problems, at least the problems they had. And, you know, like, what do we do with that? We're pissed off all the time. So
True.
I like
Kara.
I would just reiterate that I really enjoyed the characters, and I think family stories are so rich and so interesting. And one of my favorite icebreakers is how did your birth order impact who you are as a person? You know, there's just so much that we can learn about ourselves by unpacking the people that came before us. And so I just think that there's a lot there that could be probably thousands of stories, depending on which element of your own personal reality you're trying to highlight. So I just think it's an interesting approach, really, really fun, and appreciated that.
Thank you.
I mean, and you connected it back to the theme very, very well. Right. And so there was, you know, you didn't have to make excuses. It was all there. It was there. All right. What about opportunities? What about opportunities for Lynne? What can she experiment with, try, explore? I'll go first. Lynne, so one big thought and one little thought. So the big thought might solve for the little thought. To Kara's point, there's a lot in this story. There's so much in this story, and it like has the potential to be 50 stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you will have a tighter, more pointed, more punchy story if you narrow your focus, actually. And so if you want to talk about spunky women, let that be your theme. If you want to talk about courage, let that be your theme, right? If you want to talk about overcoming difficulties, let that be your theme. But like, you don't need all of them in order to like really drive the point. And if you're trying, especially, I mean, you even said like at the end, you're like, well, I think I have spunk, right? Like I was like, okay, there's your theme. Like pick that and go deep on that, right?
Okay.
And then you can start to narrow your scenes and your moments to really kind of bring spunk through. And so the little point was I got a little discombobulated with your characters because you were describing everybody in relation to yourself, which actually like I get, because it's a story about you, and yet great grandmother and then great aunt and then grandmother, and then I was like, what? So I was just like, name them, just give them names. And simultaneously, if you're going to focus on a theme that's much tighter, you may need fewer characters. You might just discover that, and then you can probably get away with it. Okay. So just something to play with. Kara.
I agree.
Similarly, like I was wondering because you named Noni, and then I don't think we got a name for the second one. I was like, oh, I wonder.
Just grandma.
Just grandma.
Yeah.
And then I appreciated, because I live in Schenectady, I appreciated you naming Glens Falls and Troy and everything. But that's the kind of thing where, depending on who's on the other side of your story, you could, like, actually saying those names might be confusing, as opposed to saying, and then Noni moved around from place to place before settling where she lived for 20 years. Like something like that, just to simplify it. Because when you're listening, you don't really know what is the important detail. And so you want to flesh out characters a little bit, but you don't want to include so many details that we try to hold on to things that we don't really need to. So I would just think about some of those things, depending on, to Stephanie's point, what are you driving in that specific story? And then let some other things slide away.
Okay.
Armand?
I actually had a very similar, I had a couple little items that you could practice with. One of my points was about giving or describing your characters. Either give them name, or you could just describe them very briefly. You can say, my grandma, who was this petite lady, who everybody knew, she was carrying 5 kids around and feeding. Like, you could describe somehow that when she was free, she was always doing this, or she was known to be, a person like this. You could maybe give them some characteristic that we could picture them. I was trying to picture some of those scenes, but as other folks mentioned, I was like kind of lost that which lady are you talking about now? So which one is which? So I think that's just very minimal thing that you can easily improve. Another feedback I had for you was, I think this story could be, you can inject a little bit more emotions to it. Especially when we talk about dead people. You could have a very low story that you make everyone sad and say, like, this grandma who had to bury her 6-month-year-old baby. Like, this is something that everyone can relate to and make people like have a frog in their throat. And then you could have another very high story. Like, you could add humor very easily to that story and say, like, I wouldn't consider myself to be this grandma's child if I wasn't spunky. Like every day when I face a situation, I have to have a strong voice. Otherwise, like, you can add some fun and like make it like the story to be a little bit more emotionally shallow and deep in some cases. Yeah, that's it.
I agree with everything you're all saying.
John?
I wanted to know, I wanted to, kind of expanding on what Armand said, I want to know one specific way that these women shaped who you are and what you aspire to. I wanted to be able to walk away with that. Also, an important qualification on what I said earlier, like, I'm not diminishing, like, there's plenty of reasons to be frustrated or, about things that we see going on in society in the world. I'm not diminishing any of that. I was merely speaking to how much I enjoyed the optimism and stuff of these two characters.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you so much. I got confused even as I was talking, and I know the women, so I kind of imagine it probably could be. And it's funny, when I thought about it, I was actually only going to talk about my great-grandmother when I first started about it. But then I started thinking of my grandmother and how she was on my dad's side, and yet they both kind of influenced me. And I just want to say really quickly to Armand is that I cried my first time doing this, so I think now I'm afraid of putting too much emotion into the stories because I don't want to start crying.
Okay, no, that's as long as you can manage that emotion.
I know, I gotta.
It may be very emotional for you, but not for others. So yeah,
right. So then I'm sort of easing back from like a little bit of emotion because I don't want to be like. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this very much.
Well, thank you, Lynne, for your story. It was lovely.
Visit wolfandheron.com to find out more about our story hours.